All right, everybody, let's go ahead and complete this project by finishing up the My Profile page. So what we want to do is I want to add a form here where you are able to create a new note. Now, each note is going to have a title as well as the note itself. And then, of course, we're going to have a button that's going to allow us to submit the note to our database. So very simply, let's just go over here. Let's go over to our My Profile page. And then in the My Profile page, we're going to create, that option. So over here inside of the components, let's just create another directory. And I'm going to call this notes. And then in here, I am going to create a form.view. And then in here, let's define the template. So I'm going to say template like so. And then I'm going to say div. And just to see that this works a-okay, let's just have an h1 here. And then let's just say hello in our h1. Now let's move to our form and let us just say, what was it called again? It was going to be called notes form, I believe. All right, looking good. Notes form in order to auto import this component. As you can see, we get hello. Looking good, looking good. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is this is going to be a little bit of styling. So if you want, I'm going to have the lecture code attached to this video if you want to just skip it. But if not, let's just go ahead and do this ourselves. So I'm going to put an N card here. N card like so. Save that. Now there's nothing in there, so we can't really see the card. There we go. And we're also going to give this some styles as well. So let's just say style, scoped. And over here, let's just close it off. Just say style like so. Now the card itself, let's give it a class of just container. Container like so. Now this shouldn't, if I go to my profile here, okay. So I can just say container. And very simply, like I did right in here, we can give it the same kind of styles. So let's just go here. Let's just give this the same sort of styles. Let's just save that. Let's refresh. Go to my profile. There we go. Looking decent, I guess. Not looking particularly great, but it's looking okay. So over here, we have our little container. And maybe this, yeah, I think we can just leave it as is. Maybe we can even just have this as a div, to be quite honest, not as an end card. Let's go here. Let's create this as a div. All right. And over here, we'll keep all of this except for the display flex. We'll remove that. And then what we'll do here is we'll add just a little bit of padding in the top. So we'll just say 3 rems and then 0 like so. Okay, so this is looking great. And then over here, now what we can do is just say maybe H3, H3, and I can say my notes. All right, this is fine to me. We can also style this to be a little bit bigger, and I think that would make a little bit of sense. So let's just say font size 2 rems. Okay, that looks great. So inside of the form, so this is where we're going to have our form. Where is my wonderful form? In here, we are going to add an N card. Well, this whole thing is going to be just an N card, I say. N card. And then over here, let's close it off. N card. And then over here, we're going to have multiple inputs. So let's have an input. And then for the second thing, let's actually have just a text area rather than an input. So let's just save it like that. And we're not rendering it in the My Profile. Let's remove this other stuff, other files that we're not using. Let's remove that. Let's go here. And right here inside of the container, I'm going to say form, and then card, like so. Form card, or no, what do we call this? We call this notes form, rather. Notes form. There we go. Okay, looking good, looking good. Now we have some inputs somewhere. I mean, we should see them right there. So here's the input, here's the text area. Obviously not very pretty. So let's go back over to our form, and we're gonna have to give some styles here. So let's say card. I'm gonna just copy this style tag here so I don't have to write it out. And let's remove all this stuff. I'm gonna say card. We're gonna give it a little bit of padding of 1.5 rems, just so it looks a little bit nicer. Now, it's still impossible to find, but it's right here. And we're gonna give this a display flex, but an align or a flex direction of column. So now we got the input, then we also have the text area. So now what we need to do is style the input as well as the text area. Haven't done CSS in a while, but I believe this is how we can style both of them together. And we can just give it a border of 0.1 rem, and we can say solid. We can say RGBA 000, which is pure black, and then we can say 0.2, something like that. Maybe that's not how it works. Let's just see. Okay, I guess that's not how it works. I forgot how to CSS for a bit. So let's just do that. And then over here, we can just maybe assign this to a class. We can just say, I'm just going to give this class of input. And then similarly over here, let's give this a class of input. And let's just change this to a class. There we go, looking okay. And let's just give it a margin bottom of let's say 0.25 rems. Okay. And lastly, let's also give it a border radius of 0.5 rems. All right, looking okay. Let's do 2.5 rems. Okay, so this is looking fine to me, honestly, whatever. And then over here inside of the input, let's just do a placeholder. And the placeholder, we're going to say here the my notes title. And then over here, we're going to say my note. Or my, you know what, we can just say my title, my note, like this. Just so we can give them a little bit of feedback. And also just so it's not just all the way here, or like all the way to the left. Let's give it a little bit of padding. We'll say 0.5 all around, or 0.25 all around. Okay, so this is looking pretty good to me. I don't really care about the styles. Lastly, let's add an end card, or end button rather. And this is going to have the text of create note or save note or whatever. We'll say save note. And then over here, let's have an end button, close it off. All right, so this is fine. It looks hideous, but whatever, it's okay. We can also make the button have like a fixed width, or maybe so it doesn't span the whole thing, but this is fine to me. And then over here, right below, we'll just actually display all of our notes. So let's actually begin now with making this functional. So the thing that we need to do is we need to add a script here, and we need to two-way bind this, of course. So let's go over here. Let's say script. We're going to say setup lang is equal to ts. And then what we're going to do is let's have a reactive state. So I'm going to say const. I'm going to say this is going to be notes input is equal to reactive. And over here, we're going to have the title, which is going to be an empty string. And then we're also going to have the note itself, which is also going to be an empty string. Over here, let's just go ahead and two-way bind this. So we're going to say vModel. we're going to say notes input dot title. And then over here, let's just copy this. And let's also do notes input. And then we're going to say dot note for this. Okay, so this is pretty much it. That's the setup for this ugly thing that we have here. But now what we need to do is we need to talk about how we're going to make this functional. Because what we actually need to do is create this note and then save it into our database. And this could get potentially tricky. So let's actually talk about how we're going to do that in the next video. In the last video, we have created this wonderful award-winning designed form. Absolutely beautiful. But of course, it is not functional. So what we want to do is make this functional. Now, in order to make this functional, what needs to happen is when we click on a title, or when we type a title and type a note and then click on this Save Notes button, what needs to happen is it needs to save inside of the database that we are hosting on Supabase. Now, what database are we hosting on Supabase? Well, Supabase is going to host a Postgres database for us. Now, Postgres is a SQL database, meaning that this is a database that uses the SQL language. So we need to understand first exactly how SQL databases store data in order to figure out how we're going to store this data right over here. Now, if you're unfamiliar with SQL or Postgres or SQL databases in general, that's a-okay. Completely fine. Let's talk about how we're going to store this data via a SQL database right now. Now, SQL databases, they store different entities in things called tables. So for example, let's say I was creating a application about I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head. Let's just say I'm creating a blog application, and this blog you can comment on any particular blog that you want. Well, I might want to have an entity for the blog itself, and then I can have another entity for the comment. So each particular entity is going to have a table where we're going to store the associated data for that particular entity. Now over here, we only really have one entity, which is the notes. So this notes is going to have its own table. So this right over here, this box is going to represent the table itself. And we're going to call this table notes. Now inside of this table, like an ordinary table, we can have multiple different columns. And the columns are essentially the things that we want to store inside of this table. So we're going to want to have a title as well as the notes. So we can have these two columns right over here. We can have a title column as well as a note column. Now for SQL, we need to also define the type of this column. So over here, we're going to define that this is going to be text for both the title as well as the note. And now by defining that it's going to be text, we can't put in a number here. We cannot put in a Boolean. For each particular column, it will always be a text because SQL is very strict about its types. So over here, we can say text and text. So you might be thinking, well, this is great. This is all it is that we need. Well, no. We need a way to uniquely identify each particular row inside of our table. Now, how are we going to do that? Because, well, theoretically, two people can have the exact same title. Maybe my title is I need to buy a camera, and somebody else wants to buy a camera as well, and they have that exact same title. So we cannot uniquely identify by the title. And we can't also uniquely identify by the note itself because, again, even though it's unlikely, it is still very possible that two people can have the exact same note. So we cannot uniquely identify by these two things. Now, why do we need to uniquely identify by it? But let's say we want to update a particular note. Well, what note do we want to update? We want to update the note by, let's say, the title, my camera is dying or whatever. I want to buy a new camera. Well, again, we can have multiple entities with that particular title. So we can't, again, uniquely identify by that title or by the note. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another column called ID. This is going to be a big integer, which is essentially a very special type in SQL that just allows us to store large integers. So 1, 2, I think to like the billions. So it's just you can just think of it as an integer that allows us to go to the billions. And this is going to be unique across every single row in our table. So therefore, this is going to uniquely identify each row. So if I want to say get the note with the ID of 27, there's only going to be one row with the ID of 27. Now, because this is going to uniquely identify a particular row, we call this in SQL as a primary key. A primary key. So this is a very important concept in SQL. A primary key is the thing that is going to uniquely identify a row in a table. So now you might be thinking we're done. Well, no, not quite. Now what we need to do, the last thing we need to do is we need to somehow relate this note to the user that created it. Because at this point, well, we have no idea who created this note. I can create this note and then save it to the DB, but then there's no way that we can relay it back to myself. So we need to have another column that relays this note to that user, the user that has created it. And I'm going to call this user ID. And this is going to be a UUID. Why is it going to be a UUID? Well, in Supabase over here, if I were to go to authentication, it gives each user a unique UUID. So we're going to actually use this UUID. And of course, we can access this user UUID by accessing the user themselves. We're going to use this UUID to identify that particular user. So over here, we're going to have user ID, and it's going to be a UUID, depending on, of course, which user created it. Now, because this over here is linking to a particular user, we're going to call this a foreign key. So this ID right over here is linking to another entity, and that entity is a user. Again, it is called a foreign key. So this is a unique identifier for another entity that we are utilizing in order to link them together in this table. And again, that's called a foreign key. So this is what we are going to create. Let's actually go ahead and very quickly create it right now. So in order to create it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the SQL editor, and we're going to have to write some SQL code to create this table. So I'm going to go here to the SQL editor, and I'm going to say create table over here. So let's go here. Let's click on it once more. And right away, you can see we get some boilerplate SQL code. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Let me see if I can. Okay, let me zoom out. Hopefully you guys can see this. So you can see here, this is SQL code. So we're using a SQL database. We need SQL in order to create tables and do other sort of manipulation. So it begins with create table. So we're creating a table. And then over here, we need to specify the table name. I'm going to call this notes. We can call it whatever it is that we want. I'm going to call it notes, of course. And then over here, we have these parentheses. So these parentheses right here. Now, inside of these parentheses, we're going to define all of the columns that we want in this table. And we're going to separate each column by comma. Now, the first one over here is ID, which is something that we want. We're specifying that it is a big int. And then we're also saying that we want to generate this by default as identity primary key. Now, this isn't really SQL code. I believe this is something very specific to Supabase. But this just allows us to generate this by default, so we don't have to specify the ID every time. SQL itself is going to do it. And we're also saying that it is going to be a primary key, which means that it is going to be unique across every single column in our DB. All right, so this is looking good. So let's just go ahead and remove all this other stuff here. We don't need that. And then over here, let's specify some of the other columns. So I'm going to say here text, or sorry, not text. I'm going to say title. I'm going to say that this is going to be a text. And then I'm going to say note itself, which is also going to be a text. And then over here, we're going to say user ID. We're going to say that this is going to be a UUID, like so. And that's pretty much all it is that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and run this query. And when we run this query over here in our database, we should get a new table. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this query. So over here, successful, no rows returned. Makes sense. And then over here, when we click on the database, you can see now we have this brand new notes table with 4 columns. We created our table. Now what I want to do is whenever we click on this button, I want to save all the necessary information into a new row in that notes table. So let's go ahead and just create a function for this. And I'm going to say a function called add note, or maybe you can even just call this handle submit, something like that. Handle submit. And over here, the first thing that I want to do is I want to check that these inputs right over here, these pieces of state, they're not empty. So I'm going to say here, if they're not empty, or if they are empty, so I'm going to say if notes input dot title is empty, or notes input dot note is empty, then I just want to return early. Else we want to continue. Now over here, we could also display some sort of error message just so we can have better handling to the particular user. But again, whatever, that's fine. We're just going to return early and not do anything. Over here, then we're going to go ahead and actually add the note. So then what we're going to do is we want to add the note to this new notes table. So how do we do that? Well, actually, really easy. We don't even have to write any SQL. Supabase acts as an ORM that allows us to write SQL code by using just simple JavaScript object-oriented notation. So let's go here and let's just grab Supabase, and then we're going to grab that from the composable, the Supabase composable. And then over here, what we can do is we can mark this as async. So we can just say async like so. And we can just say await Supabase. And then we can say dot from. And then over here, we need to specify inside of this method, we need to specify the table we want to manipulate. In this case, it is going to be notes. So I'm going to say the notes table. And then I'm going to say dot insert. So how do we want to manipulate it? So I'm going to say dot insert. And then I'm going to say, well, the columns that we want to add. So we want to add the title, which is going to be notes input dot title. So notes input dot title. We also want to add the note itself, which is going to be notes input dot note. And the last thing that we also need is the ID. So this is going to be the user ID. Now we can actually go ahead and grab that from user use auth, that use auth composable that we created. Over here we can say user ID. We can say user dot value dot ID. Now we're always going to have an ID here. This is never going to be null because, well, we can't reach this form if the user is null, because this form only exists in the My Profile page. So that's pretty much all it is that we need to do. Very simple. And then what we can do is, well, we can actually clear the input. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say notes app.title. I'm going to say that is going to be equal to, well, it's going to be equal to an empty string. And then over here, we're going to say notes.note. And this too will also be equal to an empty string, just so we can clear the title. And let's go ahead and actually give this a quick go. So let's go over here. I'm going to just do a quick little refresh. Let's go to my profile. I'm going to add a note. So my first note. And then over here, I'm going to say this is a note for my Udemy course. I'm going to go ahead and click on Save Note. And I was expecting it to clear the note input. It did not do that. Let's just see if it actually added it inside of our DB. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And it was 0 rows. Now it is still 0. So I wonder why exactly that is. So we have Supabase dot from. We're specifying the notes. We got the note. We got the title. We got the user. So let's actually see, maybe the console has something for us here. Oh my goodness. No, I know exactly what's going on. I didn't bind it. I always forget binding it. So let's go over here. Let's just say click, handle submit. Okay. Let's just do a quick little refresh. Let's go to my profile, say my new note. And then over here, let's just say this is a note for my Udemy course. Now let's go ahead and save this note. Now you can see it clears. Now let's go here. Notice that this is a 0. I'm going to go ahead and just refresh this. Hopefully it actually saved into our database. Let's see. There we go. We can actually see it now. We can see that we have one row. That means it actually indeed was saved into our database. If I click on this, you can see all the different columns. I forget how to see the I don't think it's possible to see all the rows, but nonetheless, it was added. So this is great. The next step now is to actually start retrieving all of the notes and, well, displaying them here. To wrap this video up, what we're going to start doing is inside the myprofile.view page, we're going to make a request to our Supabase server to get all of the notes for the particular user that we are currently logged in as. And we're going to display them right over here, right below this form. So relatively simple. So let's go over here to the My Profile page. And we're going to grab two things. We're going to grab Supabase, which is the ORM we're going to use in order to fetch the data. So we're going to grab that from the composable that we created. And we also need to grab the current user because we need to use that user ID. So we're going to say use auth. Go ahead and invoke that. Looking good. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, of course, what we want to do is we want to fetch the notes data. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign notes equal to ref, and initially I am going to set it to nothing. And then once we fetch our data, we should be able to populate this with the array of objects, which is going to be the note itself. All right, so over here, just right below it, what I'm going to do is as soon as we run this, I'm going to say if the process is client, so if we are in the client, then what I want to do is I just want to grab the user. So I'm going to say, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and fetch the note. So I'm going to say notes dot value is going to be equal to await Supabase dot from. Remember, this is going to specify the notes themselves, so slash from notes. And then what we want to do is we want to select all the notes. But now what we want to do is we want to specify a filter. So we only get the notes with the specific user ID that belongs to this user over here. So what I can say here is dot equal. And then over here I can say I want the user ID to equal the user dot value dot ID. So that's pretty much it. That's all it is that we need to do. So over here, let me just go ahead and just render the notes just so we can see them. And as you can see, we get back here error null data, the data itself. So maybe what we can even do is maybe we can just maybe call this notes response. I think that would make a little bit more sense. So you can say notes response. And then right over here, we can say notes response like so. Now, lastly, let's just create a div. And we're only going to render this div vif notes response. So notes response dot data. So dot data. So if there is actually data in there, meaning that there's an array of objects, and as you can see, we're actually getting our array of objects right over here. We're also getting some other information like the count, the status, etc., the body, whatever. But what we want is the data, of course. So if the notes response.data, then what we want to do is, well, we want to iterate over a bunch of n cards. So let's go here. So I'm going to say n card like so. And let us just say v4. And I'm going to say for each note in notes card or notes response.data, let's also specify the key, which we're going to say is note.id, because remember, we get the unique identifier for each particular note. And over here, let's just specify an h2 for the title. Let's say here, so we're going to say note.title, and then let's just specify a paragraph tag for the note itself. And that's pretty much it. So over here, we can say note.note, save that, and doesn't look that great, but hey, whatever. Let's just go here and maybe you can style this a little bit better. So let's give this a class of card. So we're going to say card here, give it a little bit of padding, maybe a rem of padding, and let's say card h2, font weight of bold, and then font size of 0.5 rems. All right, so this is good. And let's also give it a margin top of 1.5 rem as well. And okay, so let's go here. Let's just refresh, go to my profile. You can see my notes. The issue is, okay, so what we need to do here, so we got this here. Let's go over here to this div. Let's just give this a class of card container. Let's give that a margin. Let's give that a margin of margin top of 2.5. Let's go back to home. Let's just refresh here. Okay, looking good. Okay, it was a huge margin right here, and that's because over here we also need to specify the margin in the card. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. So now you can see my notes, and this is my new note. So I can go now. I can just add a new note. This watch NBA playoffs. This is more like a to-do. Watch NBA playoffs. I wish that the Raptors would win. I'm in Canada, so I should root for the Raptors. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this. And what we don't do is we don't populate it right away. It might be a better user experience to populate it right away. We could also, if we want to, just change the state and then push the data onto the state. But this is just more of a view thing. It's not really specific to Supabase and Nux. So let's just go back, and let's go back to my profile, and you can see now we actually have it. Okay, looking great. Now let me go ahead and just log out. Now we shouldn't see, I'm going to log out and log into a different account. We shouldn't see these notes. So I'm going to log out. I'm going to log into my Blumber account. So blumbercourse@gmail.com. I believe my password is the same thing. And now you can see I actually do not see the notes. So it's very specific to the user that has created it. So my other accounts, I'm going to say, hello, everyone. Everyone, how is it going? I'm going to go ahead and save the note. And now if I go back to it, you can see this is my other account. And now let's go ahead and try to log back into this account now. There we go. We got a full-fledged authentication system. How cool is that? So I hope you guys learned a lot.